The first time I caught myself hesitating, I honestly thought I was just having an off day. I was standing in my garage on a Tuesday morning in early April, staring at an 8-foot ladder that had been sitting in the same corner for at least 15 years. Nothing unusual about that. Every spring, after the weather finally stopped changing its mind, I pulled the ladder out to clean the gutters and check the storm damage around the house. I had done it so many times that I could probably have written the routine down from memory. Move the truck, pull out the ladder, grab the gloves, climb up, finish before lunch. That morning, though, I stood there longer than I expected. Not because I was afraid of falling, not because anything hurt. I just found myself looking at the ladder and thinking about it more than I remembered ever thinking about it before. I remember checking the weather on my phone. 58 degrees. Light wind. Perfect day to get started. I even had the local radio station playing in the background, the same station I had listened to since the 1980s. Everything felt familiar except for one thing. Me. I eventually laughed at myself, picked up the ladder, and got on with it. But the thought stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, I drove over to the hardware store to buy replacement furnace filters and bird seed. I had retired from managing a building supply store almost 9 years earlier, but I still enjoyed walking through hardware aisles. Some habits stay with you. I spent 20 minutes looking at garden tools I did not need, and another 10 minutes talking to a cashier about whether we were going to have another dry summer. On the drive home, I realized something else. I felt tired. Not exhausted. Not sick. Just finished. That surprised me because I had not really done very much. I unloaded the bags from the truck, made myself a sandwich, and sat on the back porch. Across the street, my neighbor was teaching his grandson how to throw a baseball. I watched them for a while and tried to figure out why the day felt different. Maybe I had slept poorly. Maybe I needed more coffee. Maybe I was simply having one of those days people have when they get older. The strange part was that I could not remember having many of those days before. A week later, I walked past that same ladder in the garage and found myself slowing down again. That was the moment I started wondering whether the ladder had ever really been the thing I was looking at. The following Saturday, I drove out to my daughter Rebecca's house in Carmel to help her put together a storage shed she had ordered online. She had called earlier in the week and said, "Dad, I know you actually read instructions before you build things." I told her that was because I had spent 35 years watching other people ignore them. We both laughed. Truthfully, I was looking forward to it. Ever since I retired, I had discovered that helping my kids with projects gave structure to my week in a way I had never expected. Besides, I liked the feeling of being useful. Rebecca had coffee ready when I arrived, and my grandson Tyler was already in the backyard trying to identify which pieces belonged where. The weather was perfect. 65 degrees, blue sky, just enough breeze to keep you comfortable. The kind of day that used to make me want to stay outside until sunset. We spent the first hour sorting hardware and arguing politely with the instruction manual. Around noon, Rebecca came outside and asked if anyone wanted sandwiches. Tyler answered before she finished the question. I smiled because I remembered being that age and thinking lunch was one of the best parts of any project. When she handed me a turkey sandwich and a bag of potato chips, I thanked her and set the plate on the patio table beside me. We went back to work. About 45 minutes later, Tyler pointed at my untouched sandwich and said, "Grandpa, are you saving that?" I laughed and told him I guessed I forgot about it. He looked genuinely confused. Children notice things adults politely ignore. I ate half the sandwich mostly because he was watching. The strange part was that I did not feel hungry before I ate it, and I did not feel especially full afterward. It was simply something I had done because lunchtime had arrived. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that. Not because forgetting a sandwich seemed important. People forget things all the time. But I started replaying other moments from the past few months. The afternoon, I spent 3 hours planting flowers and never thought about dinner until 9 o'clock. The road trip to Nashville with my brother-in-law when he wanted to stop for barbecue and I suggested we keep driving. The church fundraiser breakfast where everyone talked about the pancakes while I mostly enjoyed the conversation. None of those moments had bothered me when they happened. In fact, I had explained each one away without much effort. Busy day, different schedule, not very hungry, perfectly reasonable explanations. Yet sitting at a stoplight outside Anderson, I realized I had been using the same explanation over and over again. That evening, I walked into the garage to put away a screwdriver set I had borrowed from Rebecca. The ladder was still there, exactly where I had left it. I stopped for a second, not because I was thinking about climbing it, because I was beginning to wonder whether there were other parts of my life I had quietly stopped noticing too. About 2 weeks later, I agreed to help my neighbor Carl clear fallen branches after a spring storm rolled through our part of Indiana. Carl was 78 and had spent most of his life farming before retiring. He had a way of making every task sound easier than it actually was. Couple hours of work, he told me over the phone. That usually meant 4. I drove over around 8 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and a pair of work gloves I had owned for so long I could not remember buying them. The air still smelled like wet grass and damp soil. We spent the first hour dragging branches into piles and talking about things men our age always seem to talk about: weather forecasts, property taxes, and whether trucks were built better 30 years ago. Nothing felt particularly difficult. Nothing hurt. Yet every time we stopped for a few minutes, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. I was not eager to start again. That sounds strange now that I say it out loud. I do not mean I wanted to quit. I have never been someone who avoids work. But there used to be a rhythm to physical tasks. You started. You worked. You rested. Then you went back to work without thinking about it. That morning, I found myself standing still longer than usual, looking at the next pile of branches, taking another sip of coffee, waiting for something I could not quite identify. Carl did not seem to notice. Or maybe he did and was polite enough not to mention it. Around noon, he suggested we drive into town for lunch. We ended up at a small family restaurant near the county courthouse. Carl ordered chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes and green beans. I ordered a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. Not because I particularly wanted soup. It just seemed easier to decide. We sat there for nearly an hour. Carl told stories about his grandchildren. I complained about how complicated television remotes had become. We laughed more than we ate. On the drive home, I caught myself thinking about something else entirely. 10 years ago, I would have finished that morning feeling satisfied. Tired, maybe, but satisfied. Instead, I felt oddly disconnected from the day, as if I had participated in it rather than lived it. That bothered me more than being tired. Over the next several days, I started noticing similar moments. I postponed reorganizing the garage shelves even though I had talked about doing it for months. I chose to watch a baseball game instead of working in the yard, despite the weather being perfect. I drove past the walking trail where I used to stop a few times every month and told myself I would go another day. None of those decisions felt dramatic. In fact, each one felt reasonable on its own. That was probably why I ignored them. But one evening, while sitting in my recliner and trying to remember the last time I had looked forward to doing something physical just for the enjoyment of it, I realized I could not come up with an answer as quickly as I thought I should. A few Sundays later, I volunteered to help set up tables and chairs for the annual community fundraiser at our church. I had been doing it for years. Not because anyone asked me to, mostly because I enjoyed arriving early, drinking bad coffee from a styrofoam cup, and talking to the same people I had known for decades. There is a comfort in routines that survive long after other parts of life change. That morning, I pulled into the parking lot just after 7. The sun had barely come up. The grass was still wet, and a few robins were hopping around the edge of the sidewalk looking for breakfast. I remember sitting in my truck for a moment longer than usual before getting out. Not because I was tired. At least, I did not think I was. I just found myself staring at the church entrance and mentally organizing the next few hours before I had even started. Inside, people were already moving tables across the fellowship hall. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Someone was testing the microphone system. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the year before. I grabbed one end of a folding table with another volunteer named Jerry, and we carried it across the room. Halfway there, I had a strange thought. Not a frightening thought. More of a question. When had I started thinking about simple tasks before doing them? I pushed the thought aside immediately. Everybody gets older. Everybody slows down a little. That seemed like a perfectly reasonable explanation. Around 10 o'clock, after most of the setup was finished, several of us sat around drinking coffee and eating donuts. Or rather, they ate donuts. I held one in my hand for nearly 20 minutes while listening to a conversation about property taxes and the Indianapolis Colts draft picks. Eventually, I took 2 bites and threw the rest away. Again, I explained it to myself without much effort. Maybe I had eaten too much breakfast. Except I had only eaten a bowl of cereal. Driving home, I caught myself doing something I had never done before. I started making a mental list of things I no longer did the way I used to. I no longer volunteered for the heavier jobs without thinking. I no longer took spontaneous weekend drives just because the weather was nice. I no longer looked forward to spending an entire Saturday working around the house. Each change had happened so slowly that none of them had ever seemed worth mentioning. Later that week, Rebecca called and asked if I wanted to take Tyler fishing during his spring break. A few years earlier, I would have said yes before she finished the sentence. This time, I heard myself say, "Let me think about it." She did not sound surprised. That bothered me more than my own hesitation. After we hung up, I sat in the garage for a while with the door open, listening to the neighborhood kids riding bicycles down the street. The ladder was still standing against the wall. The fishing poles were hanging exactly where they had always been. Nothing around me had changed very much. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I had been quietly rearranging my own life for a long time without ever noticing I was doing it. By the middle of May, I finally agreed to take Tyler fishing during his spring break. Rebecca had asked me twice already, and each time I had found some reason to delay giving her an answer. The weather forecast looked good. Tyler was excited. There was no real reason not to go. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Years earlier, I would have started packing the truck before anyone even finished asking. Fishing had never been about catching fish anyway. It was about getting out of the house, driving back roads, buying gas station coffee that was always too hot, and talking about things that somehow felt easier to discuss while staring at a lake. We left just after sunrise on a Thursday morning. Tyler brought enough snacks for what appeared to be a week-long expedition. I brought the same tackle box I had been carrying since the 1990s. The drive to Mississauga Lake took a little over an hour. Tyler spent most of it explaining a video game I did not understand. I spent most of it pretending I did. The morning itself was beautiful. Clear sky, light breeze, water smooth enough to reflect the trees along the shoreline. We found a quiet spot near the boat launch and settled in. For the first hour, everything felt familiar. Tyler talked. I listened. We cast our lines. We drank coffee and orange soda. But somewhere around mid-morning, I noticed something I had noticed before in other places. I was thinking about leaving. Not because I was uncomfortable. Not because I was bored. I simply felt finished. The strange thing was that I could not explain what exactly had finished. We had barely been there 3 hours. 10 years earlier, I would have stayed until sunset without giving it a second thought. Tyler, of course, wanted to stay longer. Children and grandparents experience time differently. To him, every hour was an opportunity. To me, that morning, every hour felt slightly heavier than the one before. I suggested lunch, mostly because it seemed like the right thing to do. We drove into town and stopped at a diner near the courthouse square. Tyler ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. I ordered grilled chicken and iced tea. While we waited, he asked me if I still liked fishing as much as I used to. The question surprised me, not because it was rude, because I realized I did not know the answer. I told him I thought I did. He nodded and went back to coloring the paper placemat with crayons the waitress had given him. Children accept uncertainty more easily than adults. On the drive home, Tyler fell asleep in the passenger seat. I turned the radio down and started replaying the day in my mind. Then I replayed other days. The hardware store trip that left me feeling oddly done before it had really started. The church fundraiser where carrying tables felt different than I remembered. The afternoon helping Carl with storm cleanup when rest breaks became something I anticipated instead of something I simply took. One memory by itself could always be explained. 2 memories could be coincidence. But as the miles passed beneath the truck tires, I realized I had stopped counting individual moments. They were beginning to form a shape. Later that evening, after I dropped Tyler off and drove back home, I walked through the garage without turning on the lights. The outline of the ladder was still visible against the wall from the fading sunlight coming through the windows. I stood there quietly for a moment and understood something I had been avoiding for months. The question was no longer whether things had changed. The question was how long they had been changing before I finally noticed. The realization itself did not happen during a difficult moment. That was probably why I trusted it. If it had happened after a bad day or during some kind of emergency, I might have dismissed it. Instead, it happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in June while I was volunteering at the County Historical Society Museum. Every summer, we hosted a small exhibit featuring photographs and artifacts from local businesses that no longer existed. I enjoyed those projects. There was something satisfying about organizing other people's memories. That afternoon, I spent nearly an hour labeling photographs from a hardware store that had closed sometime in the late 1970s. I remember looking at a picture of four men standing in front of stacks of lumber, all of them smiling despite the fact that they were clearly working hard. One of the volunteers, a retired school principal named Margaret, walked over and asked if I wanted to join a few of them for lunch at the cafe across the street. Normally, I would have agreed immediately. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I think I will sit this one out." She smiled politely and said she understood. After she left, I stared at the photograph in my hand for longer than I should have. Not because I was upset, because I suddenly realized I had been saying no to things I used to enjoy for reasons I could not fully explain. Around 1 o'clock, I walked outside and sat on a bench near the courthouse square. It was one of those early summer afternoons when everything feels familiar. People carrying shopping bags, traffic lights changing, someone mowing a lawn somewhere in the distance. I bought a bottle of water from a vending machine and sat there watching people walk past. For some reason, I started thinking about the previous year, then the year before that. I thought about how often I had chosen the easier option, the shorter drive, the smaller project, the earlier departure, the lighter meal. None of those choices had ever felt important enough to remember. Yet somehow, I remembered all of them. I thought about fishing with Tyler. I thought about the church fundraiser. I thought about the ladder in the garage. I thought about standing in the hardware store parking lot feeling tired after what should have been an ordinary afternoon. What struck me was not that any one thing had changed. It was that I had quietly adjusted to each change as it happened. Human beings are remarkably good at adapting. Maybe too good sometimes. If someone had asked me whether I felt different at 73 than I had at 63, I probably would have said no. But sitting there on that bench, I realized I had not become a different person overnight. I had become a slightly different person hundreds of times. A little less spontaneous, a little more cautious, a little slower to begin, a little quicker to stop. None of those changes felt dramatic because they had arrived one at a time. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Rebecca checking whether I wanted to come over the following weekend because Tyler had another baseball game. Without thinking, I almost said I would let her know. Then I stopped. Not because I suddenly felt energetic. Not because I had solved anything. I simply realized I was about to repeat a pattern I had been repeating for years. I told her yes. After we hung up, I sat there for another few minutes and allowed myself to admit something I had avoided saying out loud. My body was not behaving the way I thought it was. And whatever that meant, it deserved more attention than I had been willing to give it. That weekend, after Tyler's baseball game, I drove home by myself instead of taking the interstate. There is a two-lane road that cuts through several small towns between Carmel and Fort Wayne. I had driven it hundreds of times over the years, maybe thousands. It takes longer, but when you get older, you start measuring trips differently. Sometimes an extra 30 minutes feels like part of the reason you left the house in the first place. I stopped at a small roadside cafe outside Huntington around 3 in the afternoon. Not because I was hungry, mostly because I wanted time to think. The place looked exactly like 100 other places across the Midwest. Booths with cracked vinyl seats. Local high school sports photos on the walls. A waitress who called everyone Han. I ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie because that seemed like the sort of thing a person should order in a place like that. While I waited, I found myself replaying the conversation with Rebecca after Tyler's game. She had not said anything alarming. In fact, she had barely said anything at all. She simply asked whether I had been feeling more tired lately. I told her I was fine, which was true, mostly. But she had looked at me the way daughters sometimes look at their fathers when they are trying to decide whether to ask another question. The pie arrived, and I realized I was doing something I had been doing for months. I was studying myself, not in a fearful way, more like trying to remember someone I used to know very well. As I sat there, I started thinking about my old pickup truck. I had owned the same Ford for nearly 18 years. It still ran perfectly, but over time, small things had changed. The steering felt different than it used to. The brakes responded a little more slowly. The air conditioning took longer to cool the cab. None of those changes happened in one afternoon. They happened so gradually that I adapted without really noticing. I wondered if people worked the same way. Maybe that was part of what had confused me. I had been waiting for aging to announce itself. Instead, it had introduced itself quietly and then waited for me to catch up. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to ordinary moments in a different way. Not judging them, just noticing them. I noticed that when I carried groceries into the house, I often paused before making a second trip. I noticed that when I sat down after mowing the lawn, I stayed seated longer than I remembered staying seated years ago. I noticed that when friends suggested activities, my first instinct had gradually shifted from "why not" to "maybe." None of those things felt dramatic. In fact, I suspect most people my age would recognize them immediately. That realization brought me an unexpected sense of relief. Perhaps the problem was not that my body was changing. Perhaps the problem was that I had been comparing today's body to a version of myself that no longer existed. I later read something that stayed with me. It said that many people do not experience aging as a steady decline. They experience it as a series of small adjustments that become visible only when viewed together. That made more sense to me than anything else I had heard. Maybe that was why I had missed so many clues. I had been evaluating each change separately instead of recognizing the pattern they created together. Sitting on my back porch one evening with a glass of iced tea and the sound of cicadas filling the neighborhood, I realized that my body had not suddenly become unfamiliar. It had been introducing me to a new version of myself for years. I simply had not understood that I was supposed to be paying attention. The changes I made afterward were smaller than I expected. Maybe that was why I actually kept doing them. For a few weeks, I considered making some dramatic plan. Joining a gym, buying new equipment, reinventing my daily routine. Fortunately, I knew myself well enough to understand that I would probably quit by Thursday. Instead, I decided to treat myself the same way I had treated customers back when I managed the building supply store. If someone walked in with a problem, I never told them to rebuild the entire house. I told them to fix one thing at a time. So that became my approach. The first thing I changed was something so simple it almost felt embarrassing. I stopped waiting until I felt ready to do things. If I wanted to walk around the neighborhood, I put on my shoes first and worried about motivation later. If Rebecca invited me somewhere, I tried to answer before my mind had time to build an argument against going. If I planned to work in the yard, I set a timer for 20 minutes instead of expecting myself to spend the entire afternoon outside. It turned out that beginning was often the hardest part. Once I started, I usually kept going longer than I expected. Around the same time, I began paying attention to how I organized my days. I noticed that I had quietly developed a habit of stacking difficult tasks together and then feeling frustrated when I did not have the energy to do all of them. So I stopped doing that. One errand in the morning, one project in the afternoon, one social activity during the week instead of 3. That did not make me less productive. Oddly enough, it made me feel more capable. One Saturday morning, I met Carl for breakfast at a diner we had both been going to for years. He ordered pancakes. I ordered oatmeal and eggs. Somewhere in the middle of our conversation about fishing licenses and property taxes, I mentioned that I had started pacing myself differently. He laughed and said, "Welcome to the club. I have been pretending I am still 58 for the last 20 years." We both laughed harder than the joke deserved. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "The trick is not fighting the change. The trick is learning the new rules." I thought about that for days. Maybe that was what I had been resisting. Not aging itself. The idea that I needed a different set of instructions. Over the rest of the summer, I noticed small improvements. Not dramatic improvements. Real improvements. I stopped feeling disappointed when I needed more time to recover after a busy day. I stopped comparing every decision to the way I would have made it 15 years earlier. I started taking evening walks again, even if some of them lasted only 15 minutes. I agreed to attend Tyler's baseball games without calculating how tired I might feel afterward. Most importantly, I stopped treating every change as evidence that something was wrong. One evening in late August, I sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade and watched the sun disappear behind the trees at the end of the street. The neighborhood sounded exactly the way it always had. Lawn sprinklers, distant traffic, somebody grilling hamburgers. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was losing a version of myself. I felt like I was finally getting to know the person I had already become. By early October, I found myself back in the garage on a cool Saturday morning, standing in front of the same 8-foot ladder that had started all of this. The air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and motor oil. Somewhere down the street, somebody was using a leaf blower. I stood there for a moment and laughed quietly to myself. Not because anything was funny, because I finally understood why that morning months earlier had stayed with me for so long. It had never really been about the ladder. It had been about recognition. About the uncomfortable feeling of realizing that something familiar no longer felt quite the same. This time, though, I did not stand there wondering what was wrong with me. I stood there understanding that nothing had gone wrong at all. I still cleaned the gutters that morning. I still took breaks. I still moved more carefully than I had 20 years earlier. But I no longer treated those facts as evidence of failure. Later that afternoon, I drove to Tyler's final baseball game of the season. The weather had turned cooler. Parents sat in folding chairs wrapped in sweatshirts and jackets. Someone nearby was drinking hot chocolate. Tyler struck out twice and smiled both times. That seemed important somehow. After the game, we stopped for hamburgers. He ordered the largest meal on the menu. I ordered something smaller. For the first time in a long while, I did not compare that decision to who I used to be. We sat there talking about school, fishing, and whether he thought his team would be better next year. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me and asked if I wanted to go fishing again in the spring. Months earlier, I probably would have hesitated. I might have wondered how tired I would feel or whether I would enjoy it as much as I once had. Instead, I heard myself say yes before I had time to think about it. Not because I suddenly felt younger, because I had stopped waiting to feel exactly like the person I remembered being. On the drive home, I thought about how strange aging really is. When we are young, we expect change. We expect to grow, adapt, and become different versions of ourselves. Somewhere along the way, though, many of us begin expecting ourselves to stay the same forever. Maybe that is why getting older can feel so confusing. Not because our bodies change, but because we keep comparing today's reality to yesterday's memory. I do not think my body betrayed me. I do not think it failed me. I think it spent years trying to introduce me to a new version of myself, and I was too busy looking backward to notice. The truth is, I still have days when I feel frustrated. I still occasionally wonder why certain things take longer or feel different. I still catch myself thinking about the man I was at 55 or 65. But I no longer believe that growing older means losing yourself. I think it means learning yourself again. A few evenings ago, I sat on my back porch with a blanket over my knees and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. The neighborhood sounded exactly the way it always had. Dogs barking in the distance. A car door closing somewhere nearby. Wind moving through the branches. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up with my own life. I felt like I was finally living inside it. And if there is one thing I wish someone had told me sooner, it is this. Sometimes the quietest changes deserve the most attention, not because they should frighten us, but because they may be our body's way of asking us to meet ourselves again with a little more patience, a little more kindness, and a little more curiosity. If any part of this story felt familiar, then perhaps you are not falling behind either. Perhaps, like me, you are simply learning the new rules of becoming yourself.